with Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise at report stage to speak to Bill C-56. There were some important amendments that were made at the committee stage that were based on the good work of the NDP leader and his own private member's bill in respect of the Competition Bureau. Those amendments give the Commissioner the ability to launch their own investigations without having to get permission from the Minister first. They raise the penalties and they make it easier to show an abuse of market dominance. Right now you have to show both that there is a dominant market player, that harm has been done by their activity, and that they had the intention to do harm. And getting all of those three things together is often very difficult, particularly in respect of intent, particularly because traditionally the Commissioner hasn't had the authority to subpoena documents. Lowering that threshold so that you have to prove market dominance and either harm or intent is going to mean that it's a lot easier to address anti-competitive behavior. And of course, there are a number of amendments, again, based on the work of the NDP leader and his private member's bill that will be coming in the Budget Implementation Act, C-59, that was just tabled not long ago. So New Democrats are very proud to be working at improving the powers of the Competition Bureau to try and protect Canadian consumers by ensuring that in markets where competition is possible, companies aren't abusing their market position in order to reduce that competition. We're likewise pleased to move forward with getting rid of the GST on purpose-built rental, because we know there is certainly a housing crisis. I've talked a lot about that in this place. Many others are talking about it today, rightly so. One component of that crisis and addressing it is to get more purpose-built rental of any kind, including market rental. But what we've said all along, and ever since C-56 was tabled, was that it has to be accompanied by direct action to build more non-market housing, because that's the housing that can be built and sustained at rents that people can truly afford. So yes, there are Canadians who have the means to pay for market housing but are struggling to find it. Yes, there can be a salutary effect on the price of rent and drive it down if there's more supply than there currently is. We know it's a pretty tight market. But we can't kid ourselves into thinking that that alone is going to be sufficient in terms of addressing the housing crisis, and that's why direct investment in non-market housing is so important. It's why in the Budget Implementation Act that was tabled recently, I just made reference to, C-59, there's also an amendment that will see this GST rebate extended to cooperatives, which were left out of the government's initial drafting of Bill C-56, something that New Democrats think is very important. But I also want to take a moment to express our disappointment. And I had a conversation with the Minister of Finance when she appeared at the Finance Committee on Bill C-56, that the government refuses still, and we would encourage them to do this as soon as possible by whatever legislative vehicle is required, and we're certainly willing to help pass it, to extend that GST rebate to projects that have secured funding under the National Housing Strategy that are led by nonprofits. So whether that's the Co-Investment Fund or the Housing Accelerator Fund or a number of the funds that are available, we know there are nonprofit organizations that started out and things looked promising, interest rates were low, they secured government funding, they were going to build either affordable or social housing in their community, and then interest rates started going up and the projects were put on hold because those organizations no longer had the money that they needed in order to make those projects a success. Our point is that even though those projects may have started prior to September 14th, if the GST rebate is extended to those projects, that could be the difference that they need in their project in order to accommodate those higher interest rates and nevertheless be able to proceed with the project and get those units built. We know that the government is out there talking about those units as part of the total number that their National Housing Strategy has funded, even as they know that those units have stalled out. And even as there's a mechanism, the extension of the GST rebate to those projects in order to get them to move ahead. And I think it's inappropriate for the government to be out there talking about those units as if they're going to get built when they know full well that the changes in the interest rate have meant those projects are not going to go ahead, even as they refuse NDP calls to extend the GST rebate to those projects so that they can move forward in any event. Because for New Democrats, and I think unfortunately this is quite unlike the Liberals, we're not satisfied at the announcement. What we're looking for, and the metric of success for New Democrats, is when a family moves into a new unit. So the fact that the announcement got made just means that the work has begun. It doesn't mean that the work has ended. And if we're going to follow through on those units that have already been announced, that means extending the GST rebate to those nonprofit organizations, projects that started in advance of September 14th, so that real families can move in to units that they can afford. And that's really important, and I exhort the government again to take another look at that. It's a drop in the bucket cost-wise, and what it's going to mean is a lot of units getting built for families. It's an example of the kind of intentional policy we need to adopt, and that is absent not only in the Liberals' national housing strategy, but also in the Conservative leader's so-called plan for housing. He attached affordability conditions in his plan to the GST rebate. I think one of the challenges of that isn't that New Democrats don't endorse affordability, it's that the GST rebate is meant to make market projects pencil out. And so if you give a GST rebate, but you attach an affordability criterion that also stresses the budget, then you end up with a net effect being that developers who want to build market rental housing don't necessarily see the financial incentive to move ahead, because the GST rebate is offset by the fact that they have to offer more affordable rents. So that's why we think it's acceptable to have a blanket GST rebate for purpose-built rental, because it's going to incent market housing, but you have to have a real policy that addresses the need for non-market housing, properly affordable and social housing. That's just simply not in the leader of the Conservative Party's plan. It's just not there. He talks about releasing federal land in order to build more housing, and he doesn't talk about requiring any of that housing to be affordable or social housing. And when we talk about the major levers that the federal government has at its disposal, beyond its ability to tax and spend, one of the big things that the federal government has as a lever in order to incent more affordable and social housing is land. And so attaching conditions to the release of that land is one of the best things that a federal government could do from the point of view of developing more affordable and social housing. And so I think it's remarkable, particularly in light of the controversy around another Conservative government, Doug Ford's government in Ontario, taking rules off development of the Greenbelt that they've subsequently had to put back on because it was scandalous and because developers were set to get rich on that, including a lot of developers that showed up at the wedding of the Premier's daughter. I mean, none of that looked right from the outside, and apparently now not from the inside either. And so that's why it's really important when you talk about freeing up land for development, that the process is transparent and that there's a lot of accountability in that process. And if part of the idea of releasing that federal land, as it should be, is to create more affordable and social housing, all the more important that that be talked about up front, which is not done in the Conservative leader's bill. What is talked about in the Conservative leader's bill is withdrawing resources from municipalities that don't meet an Ottawa set target. Now that's problematic because we know Canada has many different kinds of communities with many different kinds of needs, and I, for one anyway, don't believe that as a rule, people who are elected to public office at the municipal level are plotting how to kill development in their community. Quite the opposite. They're looking at how to develop, whether it's business, whether it's housing, which is needed for business, or the underlying infrastructure, like wastewater and sewage and electricity. These are all things that you have to have access to in order to build housing on any particular lot. So the idea that municipalities that are already struggling to get enough housing built in their own community need to have their resources cut, which will make it harder for them to build that underlying infrastructure that nobody else is going to pay for, makes absolutely no sense. It's a recipe for failure. So what can we do? We can pass Bill C-56. We can extend this GST rebate not only to co-ops but to nonprofits that were already in the pipeline before this announcement, and a lot more besides, Madam Speaker. Hopefully I'll get a chance to speak to some of those things in the question and answer.
Okay, il n'a pas proposé d'amendement. Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader. Well, yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I appreciate a number of the comments that the member has made. And just to emphasize or re-emphasize that the federal government has agreements with jurisdictions that see substantial numbers. Like in Manitoba alone, you're probably talking somewhere in the neighborhood, and my best guesstimate would be 20,000 plus housing units that are currently non-profit that the Government of Canada subsidizes. But over the years, we have seen ongoing support to expand nonprofits. And I think of Habitat for Humanity in particular, who's done a lot of fine work. Actually, the best program that's been administered in the last 20 years, this isn't provincial or federal, even municipality, when it comes to infill housing, it's been Habitat as a stakeholder. They're the ones that are actually building and putting in new homes, and they're affordable homes, Madam Speaker. And I don't think we give some of those outside stakeholders enough credit for the fine work that they do. And I'm wondering if my colleague could provide his thoughts, because I believe Habitat's headquarters, I think it's on Archibald in the member's own riding, and the fine work that they do, but to point out that stakeholders also play a critical role, not just any specific level of government, but there's a larger picture that needs to be looked at.
Yeah, you deserve credit.
With Transcona.
Well, there's certainly a lot of actors in the space, and Habitat for Humanity is an excellent one. I'm very proud of the work that they've done in the communities that I represent. I would say, though, I think that the number that really captures the National Housing Strategy is Steve Pomeroy's number, who says that for every 1 unit of affordable housing this government is getting built, we're losing 15. And part of that is because of the end of operating grants. In fact, the renewal of those operating grants was something that the Liberals ran on in 2015 and then didn't do. And that's why there's so many buildings with affordable units coming to market. It's because they can't keep their business model going without the federal operating grant. This government has not been there to renew those grants. So as those volunteer boards say, you know, the numbers don't work anymore, we don't know what to do. Some are developing new business models. Others are putting the building on the market. And that's where we're seeing REITs and big corporate landlords come in, buy up those buildings with the cash they have on hand, renovate the building, evict the existing tenants, and then invite those who can pay more in rent into those buildings. And that's why the National Housing Strategy has been such an abject failure in respect of creating more affordable and social housing units. We're losing more than we're building.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. I want to thank my colleague for his speech. He talked about social and affordable housing, about the national strategy that doesn't work. There was a Radio Canada journalist that talked about the strategies, and the federal government should have social housing built. And there's even land here in Ottawa that was declared excess land, and we won't have any building on it until much later, so 23 years later. It makes no sense. I'd like to know what my colleague thinks of that. The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona. Yes, we need a federal government that is much more ambitious when it comes to housing. The member for Winnipeg North earlier talked about the absolute total amount spent by the federal government being higher than ever. But if we take away the billions from that amount that the government said that the provinces would also contribute, and we just have the basic numbers, it's not true that we're spending more than ever before in a real sense. And if we want to know, we can look at what happened in the 1950s when the government did focus on building housing. And we don't see that today.
For Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Rise, Madam Speaker, on behalf of the people from Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou. I listened to my colleague's speech, and I do thank him for that speech, Madam Speaker. And one of the things he highlighted is the fact that as parliamentarians, we shouldn't be really satisfied based on announcements and based on photo ops. And this is a government that has really functioned based on messaging. Messaging is everything. I know that whenever we see a natural disaster in my home province of British Columbia, the government's right there to take the photo. But when it comes to providing results, they're nowhere to be found. The same thing can be said about building houses. So I'm wondering if you can expand on the fact that photo ops just aren't getting it done right now.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona in 15 seconds.
Thanks. And of course, photo ops have never gotten the job done when it comes to the construction of housing. And we've had lots of ministerial photo ops from Liberal and Conservative governments over the last 30 years, none of which make up for the cancellation of the National Housing Strategy and the end of the operating grants that sustained so much affordable and social housing in Canada up to today. It's why we need a new version of that to ensure that we're not just building at the high end of the housing spectrum, but that people are getting non-market housing